So what I want to do is just open up this BEF file that I've prepared ahead of time, so we don't have to go through the entire merge process.
Everybody knows you did the merge process. Just in the interest of timeliness now.
Right. It takes a few minutes to do that.
We merged the image, saved it as a 32-bit BEF file, and you know what? Do you know how? Can you say how big that file is? Just
well, this file.
How many megabytes?
Yeah, when I rendered this, if anybody was really sharp, they might have noticed that I lowered the resolution on this panorama just for the webinar. Now, a lot of times I'll reduce the resolution just so I can do a test and take a look, experiment with my settings. Once I get those settings perfect, I'll probably go back, I always do, and re-render it at full resolution. You can save those files in AutoPano Giga, and then you can merge the large files later, which takes longer. But for the purposes of the webinar, we wanted to keep it short. One of the questions I wanted to put out there is one that John mentioned that he gets all the time, and that is how many images should I shoot for an HDR?
Yeah, in fact, we're starting to get those questions already on the on the chat room. So
and
why don't you?
It's absolutely a valid question. One of the best questions you can ask. It depends. Probably not the answer you wanted, but it depends on the native dynamic range of the scene in front of you. And here we had a pretty wide dynamic range at Crater Lake with the bright snow and the dark shadows in the trees. So I shot 9 brackets per stop. Actually, that's not right. I actually only shot 3. But I could shoot 9. It was just going to be too cumbersome, and I found that 3 worked pretty well for the scene. But if I had a wider dynamic range, let's say the sun was in the shot, I might want to shoot 9.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is that you want to do a test series of shots. When you go out and you have a contrasty scene, do a test series of brackets. Look at your histogram. You want to make sure that the bright image contains all the shadow detail. So if you look at your histogram and you see you have a little space between the left-hand side of the histogram and where the image information starts, you're in good shape. And on the other side, you check your darkest image and look on the right-hand side of the histogram. See if you have a little space. You want to have a little space between the end of the histogram and where the image information starts. That tells you that you've captured the entire range of the light, whether it's the brightest or darkest. If your histogram shows you that, you're in good shape. Is that a good explanation? I'm not sure.
That's the same one I give, so.
Okay. And actually, I'm looking at my notes here, and that's exactly what I had written, so it must be right. Let's move on here.
All right, so you have the 32-bit image open, and I can see from your histogram that it looks like you have some blown-out highlights because there's that tail of the histogram that's outside of your display zone.
And that's exactly right. So the first thing I want to do is adjust the exposure. So I come down to the tone mapping window, and I'm going to lower that exposure a little bit. Let's see how that works. And you'll notice that the shaded area up here, which is reflecting the pixels that are visible on the screen, that I still have some pixels that are outside on both ends of the histogram. So we have to work a little bit more to fix that. And we're getting closer. What I want to do now is I see I'm losing some of the shadow detail. So I'm going to lower the contrast a bit, down to 90 or 88. And you'll see that I'm starting to get a little closer. But I still have some problems. I'm going to adjust the highlights and shadows sliders and see if I can't get that fixed. Now you see I'm doing pretty good on the highlights. Shadows still have a little bit of a problem. Well, let's move the shadow slider up a little bit. We're getting very close. I also think that now that I've lowered the kind of a global contrast of the scene, I need to add local contrast. And so I'm going to make some adjustments here and add some local contrast, which will make a big difference. Now looking at the histogram, I've done pretty well here. There are a few little problem areas. So I'm going to go to the next window, which is called tone tuning. And I am going to dodge the area down here. Now this works very much like the old darkroom techniques we used to use. The default setting is very good at 0.2. That's 0.2 EV is a fifth of the stop, but I want this a little bit stronger this time. So I'm going to set it up around 0.3. I'm going to increase the size of my brush. I'm going to increase the feather, and I'm going to, for the purpose of the demonstration, show the brush mask. I don't always do that, but
I think that would be good for the webinar. I'm not sure that the tool is showing up as much.
Right. Now what I'm concerned about is I'm still losing some image information down here in the shadows. So what I will do is very carefully use this brush over those shadow areas. And you'll see, and what makes this really useful and important to understand is this is all in 32-bit. So we're operating on a very fine level of color graduation and tonal graduation that's not available when you're working in 16-bit or 8-bit.
So the way I explain that most of the time is that it's kind of like being able to make a change to a raw image versus making a change to a JPEG image. You can do a lot more without, inducing posterization or other quantization artifacts, right?
You're absolutely right. Good analogy. Another question people have that ask, when I talk to people about HDR, sometimes people's eyes roll. It's not something that's commonly understood. I think our audience today understands the difference between an 8-bit file with 256 tone levels, or 255 rather, a 16-bit image where you have thousands of tone levels, and a 32-bit image. I wonder if I could ask you, John, how many tone levels does a 32-bit image contain? How much more picture information?
Well, I don't know. the number is huge. It's bigger than the budget deficit. Let's put it that way.
That's a good answer. Okay, so let's move on here. I think I've done pretty well here. My shadow information has improved quite a bit. I am going to brush just a little bit more here. Now, you got to be careful not to get into water areas. If you get into an area that has real smooth tonality, your correction may become visible, and you don't want that. So just in those shadow areas. Now, I think we've done a pretty good job there. I think I've captured most of the highlight information, but you have a burn tool here that works very much in the same way, and I'm going to just show how I would use that. Again, I've increased the size. I'm going to leave the default EV setting, so I want to be very subtle about it. And I'm going to brush over some of the extremely bright areas of snow, again, being careful not to get into the sky area. And then over here, we have some really bright snow. And snow, of course, is extremely reflective. Can be a problem. So I'm going to tone that down a bit. And as you can see now, I think we've been successful in getting all of the picture information where we want it. Let's go on to the next panel, which is color settings. When I first heard about HDR Expose, I was excited because I learned about the color model that the folks at Unified Color use and how much more accurate it is. It's called Beyond RGB, and it's based on human vision as opposed to the way the old cathode ray tubes worked when we had our old cathode ray monitors. And so it's a far more sophisticated model. It's not available in HDR software from other vendors, and this is the reason that I'm excited about this software. Very accurate color. Now, even though I'm very careful with my settings, when I'm capturing an image, I'll do the color temperature reading and I'll enter that into the back of the camera. That's just a starting point. Doesn't mean that I don't mess around with it later. So what I'm seeing here is that the image is a little cold looking. So I'm going to go into the white balance section here. I'm going to select Unified Color, the Unified Color model, And I'm going to click a little bit over to the warm side, the yellow side, and just enhance that a little bit. I like that a lot better. Let's go down to the color channels. And I noticed that when I shifted that color temperature over toward the yellow, I lost some of my blue intensity. So I'm going to increase the blue channel a little bit, in a very subtle way. Small adjustments.
Saturation control. Wow.
That's right, that's right. And
that really makes it pop nicely.
Well, you know, this was not the best day up at Crater Lake. This hazy sky was preventing the nice blue color in the water from looking as good as it does at other times when you have a clear blue sky. But this is closer to what my eye saw. Now, the other thing is that these trees still look a little dull. Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm.
So let's take a look at the yellow color saturation channel and boost that up a little bit. Now the tree, if you notice, looks a little more the way it appeared to my eyes. So I'm happy with that. Let's go on down and take a look at this window. Color tuning is, gotta bring it up here.
So one of the things I wanted to point out, Richard,
sure.
particularly for some of the folks on the webinar today, may be familiar with the previous version of HDR Expose, our first release. And I want to point out that the user interface now in HDR Expose 2 is really more logically oriented, sort of step through. As you can see, the way that Richard's gone about processing these files, he's just going down through the menu options, and that's really in the proper order in which you want to make those adjustments. So the tone mapping step first, then the tone tuning adjustments, then the color tuning, and that's where we're at now. So it's a lot more streamlined and straightforward to navigate through the menus that way.
I agree. As a matter of fact, the way I like to put it is the new interface is fun. You'll have a lot of fun doing this because you don't have to be, it's a really creative, intuitive process, where in the past with the previous version, it was a little bit more of a mental chore to go through all the settings. The folks at Unified Color have just made remarkable progress with this in a very short amount of time, and I have just been thrilled to be able to be a little small part of it. Let's take a look now at the tone tuning, which is a very powerful tool once you learn how it works. And the way it works is if you have a color that's not quite where you want it, you can select the eyedropper, sample that color. Now these trees still look kind of dull over here to me, so I'm going to sample that color, and I'm going to make a very subtle adjustment to the exposure of just that color. Who turned the lights on? Now this is the way the scene appeared to my eye. The digital sensor doesn't necessarily perceive color the way our eyes see color. And that's where HDR Expose 2 can really help to restore the color balance that your eyes are able to see. Anyway, so let me think if there's anything else I want to do here. Actually, I'm pretty happy with this image. I have one more step. Again, noise reduction is important. The nice thing about HDR Expose 2, 32 float, and HDR Express, did I say that right, John?
Yep.
Okay. The nice thing is that these software products, these HDR software products, do not generate a lot of noise. Some of the other software does. So you don't have a big problem with noise typically. I like to use the defaults of the dark noise threshold, the brightness noise, and I want to talk just very quickly about color noise. I reduced the color noise during my raw conversion process, and that took care of it. I don't need to apply it twice. If I do apply it twice, I run the risk of losing subtle colors, and that's not what we want to do. We want to maintain those subtle colors, so I'm not going to apply that. Any questions from your end, John?
Yeah, I've got a couple that I want to save, but for the end. One question just came in about the, um, the halo reduction. And that's one of the big things that we changed with HDR Expose 2. We no longer have the halo reduction tools. We have automatic halo elimination built into the software. So that's just removing the halos as if they didn't exist. The same way you don't see halos when you look at an HDR scene with your eyes. And that's obviously my marketing pitch on this, but Richard, you've had firsthand knowledge with this, or firsthand experience with this, as we change through the transition through the products. Maybe you can tell folks what you're seeing with regards to not having those halo controls anymore versus having it done automatically.
Good point. Good point. The halo reduction in the unified color products is somewhat unique. I don't know of any other HDR software that has. I've used just about every one of them, and you always wind up with halos, and it's a very frustrating thing because, as John pointed out, we don't have halos in our natural vision. We go out and look at a scene. There are no halos around the dark objects, and so the difference, though, here is that it's intuitive. You don't have to think about it. It's just done automatically. And if you're interested in creating HDR photographs that look the way your eyes see a scene, this is a real advancement as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's also a real time saver too, because the older algorithms took longer to calculate, and this is all happening automatically when you open the image.
That's right.
Maybe we could skip ahead. Can you pull up that indoor shot that you have? Or actually, why don't you say now how you would save when you save the image? Because that's the point now.
Well, let's just talk about that for just a second real quick. You have saving options. So when you click Save, the first thing that I do is I select BEF. Now, for people who are not familiar, the BEF file is a 32-bit file that is basically a lossless file. Is that right, John?
Yes.
And it takes up a lot less space than using a Radiance file, for example. So the first thing I do is save the BEF file, because that now has all my corrections in it, and I can come back to it later if I want to make some more fine adjustments. If I run into problems downstream in post-processing, I can always come back. So that's the first thing I do is save that. I'm going to cancel this. Then I go back and I save it again. And I'll save it as a TIFF 16-bit file. That way I have both.
So that's the first time where this image has been converted from the native 32-bit file that we merged down to something of a lower bit depth. And I think that's a big difference between our software and a lot of the other products out there that they do that step initially, and then you've already given up a lot of the data. So you have all of that granularity that you mentioned, and being able to do the dodge and burn like you did there in the trees without creating posterization effects at all.
That's exactly right.
Could you call up that photo? You just have the interior shot that you did, the living room, just to give folks another view and another use for HDR, in addition to the landscape stuff. And while you're doing that, there were questions about filters that you may use when you're out there, like polarizers and graduated neutral density filters. And I know you mentioned you had, I think a volt's worth of graduated custom filters. How many of those graduated neutral density filters are you still using now that you're doing digital pan-outs as opposed to film?
You're absolutely right. I have spent more money on filters than I have, actually. $3,000 or more on custom graduated neutral density filters, and I still use them. Now, when I use them is when I'm shooting film.
Okay.
With digital, I rarely use graduated neutral density filter. As a matter of fact, I find it detrimental to the process because it alters the values of the scene, and throws the HDR tone mapping for a loop. So it's not a good idea to use a lot of filters. I don't even use polarizers because I found that the flexibility inside HDR Expose 2, for example, is so good that I have such control over all the colors that I don't need to use filters except maybe on a very rare occasion.
Right.
Let's take a look at this scene that John just mentioned, which is an interior. Interiors are often a good place to use HDR technology.
Yeah, we have several professionals that we're working with, and that were also part of the beta program with you, that specialize in interior architecture photography, right. Especially high-end properties and stuff like that, where you're trying to balance that. So this is another use, and you did this with the Pano head as well, right?
Yes, I used the VR drive, captured about a 180-degree field of view. Again, capturing a little more than you need is a good idea. I'll show you this is a test render. This is not the final, but it's a test render. When I do my final, I'll make some more corrections to this image. Now, there's a crystal chandelier hanging over here that created some odd patterns on the wall up here. So that would be corrected in the final. Not such a big deal right now. And I could show you very quickly how the layered output came out. Now, when I did the layered output in AutoPano Giga, I didn't crop this particular one. I'll show you what I mean. And
Richard, the AutoPano Giga, does that have its own file format when you save the files, with your individual layers here, or is that saving them as TIFF files?
They're saving them as 16-bit TIFF files. You have a choice of 16-bit TIFF or 8-bit TIFF or JPEG.
Okay.
And if you look carefully, you'll notice a few things. I used a fairly wide setting on the lens, 24 millimeters, and I did run into a stitching problem right here and another one right here. Now, you'll notice when I go to the dark version that those stitching problems disappear. Isn't that interesting? When I go to the light version, the stitching problems are not apparent. I went ahead and tone mapped this and corrected the small stitching error in Photoshop. Mm-hmm. But usually you don't run into those. Occasionally, once in a while, you will. This one corrected itself somehow over here. The challenge here with a scene like this is not only to capture all of the dynamic range of the image, but also you have a bit of a challenge here with color temperature variation. The scene outside was about 9,000 degrees Kelvin, which is, in Kelvin color temperature terms, that's a cold image. Interior was lit by incandescent light at about 2,700 degrees Kelvin, which is very warm in color temperature terms. And so matching that was a challenge. And the way I did it was I processed the TIFF files twice, one at 2,800 degrees and the other one at 9,000 degrees, and then I combined them in Photoshop. And using layer techniques, I was able to combine those two and get a pleasing result. At least I think it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I think it looks really nice.
Well, thank you, John.
Okay, Richard, well, we're about 5 minutes left. I mean, maybe if you've got time, we can go another 5 minutes for questions.
Sure.
I did want to point out there's more questions coming in from folks, and I know that we had a number of folks that weren't able to make it to the webinar after all. But how can they contact you? And if they have any follow-up questions, or if they'd like to consult with you, or get any more information from you.
Right. I'm glad you asked. Let's put that information up on the screen. My business is called Richard Sisk Productions. The website is richardsiskproductions.com, and I also have an HDR site called HDR360pro.com.
Thanks for watching. Please check out our other tutorials for more information on using the software and optimal workflow techniques.